So we are three social psychologists, George Gaskell, Gordon, Sammut, and we took the challenge here to join the philosophers to think about whether what we're doing is a kind of a research program that is growing or decaying.
Sorry, I forgot.
Maybe before we start, let me just do one quick overview how we might take a Lakatosian research program. We're not philosophers, so this is a kind of summary. It seems to be a third way between a Popperian view of progress and a Kuhnian view of progress. It seems to have to do with the clarifying conditions under which something is failing, but ultimately it has to do with balancing belief in a program, vesting commitment in a program, and somehow looking at the evidence. I think with three possibilities: rationally reconstructing such changes and progresses, or see them as mystic conversion. This is the social psychology of science, which I think is very interesting, coming out of Kuhn. Or Feyerabend, whom I have had the pleasure to listen in the 1980s in Zurich for quite a while, basically thought this is a hopeless way of creating standards. What we need to have is role models, like in art. But we want to clarify whether this program, called social representation, has something like a positive heuristic, a core metaphysics, or maybe some things we should avoid. And ultimately, we are aware of the fact that research programs don't make progress, they make progress in relation to rivals that kind of might outlive programs. So this is what we're going to talk about. Now I'm giving on to George, who starts with a little bit of a tribute to Lakatos, I understand.
Yeah, well, if I may. So I joined the school in the 1970s, and I joined the social psychology department. And there was this wonderful series of seminars in the philosophy department. And at that time there were two senior figures in philosophy. John Watkins, the claws are out there named after him. John was quiet, thoughtful, an English gentleman. And then there was Imre, who was a sort of East European powder keg of nervous energy. And there was one seminar, I can't remember who was giving it or what it was about, but the person kept drawing circles and then filling with these things. Ended up with 20 circles. And there's Imre sitting on the edge of his chair. John Watkins saying, "Oh, it's very interesting talk." And we did take so much from that. And Imre leaps up. He takes the board rubber, scrubs it all off the board. He draws a circle. He points to the centre. "There's nothing here. There was nothing in your talk." This point, John, Imre, please. I don't know what happened after that, but it was just, he was a brilliant talker, speaker. That series of seminars, and I'm not a philosopher, but I really enjoyed it. It was a wonderful time. He was a great man, great contributor to the LSE. So I'm going to talk about 2 or 3 slides on the history of social psychology. This is a comment by Michael Argyle. He was a social psychologist at Oxford who made a career out of self-gradualism. And he thought that there were 3 camps within social psychology. People doing experimental work, and that was in Bristol and Oxford. Then there was a group of people studying language, which they called discourse and discourse analysis. That was at Loughborough. And then here at the LSE, and a great colleague of ours, Gerard Duveen at Cambridge, were working on social representations. But I think it's useful to go back, or go forward to the next slide and just do a little bit of history. So with the rise of fascism in Germany, quite a number of eminent psychologists left Germany and Austria. Some came to this country, some and stayed, others came to this country and went to the United States. And social psychology in the 50s was dominated by some really significant intellectuals, and they had a commitment to the social problems confronting post-World War II Europe and America. So they were concerned with the future of democracy. They were concerned with education. They were concerned with the roots of fascism. How was it that Germany, such a centre of cultural excellence, could degenerate so far? Peace, war, education. But then, particularly in America, other psychologists said, well, you know, this is all very well, but proper science is value-free. Proper science works on testing causal statements. It has statistics, and it has 0.05 probability as the criterion of success. So essentially, we had this enormous shift away from what we might call a societal psychology to experimental psychology. And it's nicely captured by Gordon Allport's challenge. Small, gem-like researchers are unlikely to contribute to the bigger picture of society. And he wanted this meta-theory, which would include man and the nature of society. And I think there's the next slide. So then we see really a bifurcation amongst the tribe of social psychologists. A group of people who are doing cognitive psychology, and more recently with the availability of MRI, they've added neuro, so it's cognitive and neuro psychology. Experimental testing in laboratories, mainly with students brought in as respondents, and of course P less than 1.05. And then you have this other tradition, which is really social representations. It's about the nature of bringing together the person and the context, but not just the person, the social milieu, groups of people and the context. Studying collective behavior, group dynamics. It can be experimental, but it's much more pluralistic in its pursuit of descriptions of phenomena, testing of propositions and hypotheses.
Oh, so you don't need that one?
And then there's this chap, Serge Moscovici. He's at the EHSS in Paris, and he's a bit of a revolutionary. He wrote a very famous book. He studied the consumption, the use, what he called the representations of psychoanalysis in French society, looking at the Catholic Church, the way it understood psychoanalysis, something like the confessional, the Communist Party, etc., etc. And Rob Farr, who was the LSE, took up Moscovici, probably the first sort of English language person to appreciate Moscovici's ideas. That led them to a collaboration, a book in 1984, where Moscovici helped in terms of the translation and writing in English. He produces this book on the phenomenon of social representations. And that's what we'll be talking about in terms of the program of research which Martin and I have been in for, 35 years, and Gordon joined more recently.
A bit less than my side, but that's fine.
A bit less than that, yes. You will. Okay, so I pass on to you.
Yeah, okay. Good morning, guys. Part two. So allow me to start by making an observation here, because there's different ways to write history, right, or to talk about history. And so when we're talking about research programs, we're talking about beliefs and ideas and concepts and that kind of work. So social representations, what are they? What, is that a concept? Is that a theory? How so? Conceptual framework, and so on and so forth. We could also be talking about people, right? Bauer, Moscovici, and the role they might have played in the development of a research program. And if I could also retrace my steps, we could also talk about particular institutions where some ideas have specialized and have been taken forward and studied, and you end up with areas of a concentration of expertise. And this is what happened in social psychology. So when I came into it, in fairness, this was kind of where we were at, where social psychology was at. If you wanted to study social representations, you wouldn't go to Bristol. You don't find it there. You find it at the LSE, you find it in Cambridge, you find it in Paris, you find it in other places around the world. If you wanted discursive psychology, you best head to Loughborough or someplace else. And so there's different ingredients when we're talking about a research program that include not just the ideas, but the people who propose those ideas and the institutions that become a home for those ideas. And one point I wish to make is that, well, things kind of move on with time and they kind of change as new ideas are proposed and new people come and others don't and so on and so forth, right? And to a certain extent, what happened over the past kind of 20 years was that you had these different tribes presenting their work at these social psychology conferences and presenting their ideas and what they were learning, and there was a lot of exploration regarding the boundaries of the different tribes. And so social representation scholars worried a little bit about how their work might have had something to do with social identity theorists, and social identity theorists worried about discursive theorists and social representations theorists. And I think what emerged out of those debates, that, well, they weren't always entirely pleasant. Some of them were very heated, some of them were very emotional. There was a lot of writing back and forth in the psychology journals about who was right about what concept and who was wrong about what other concept. But that also led to a generation of scholars who became well-versed in all the different traditions and who saw a point to discourse analysis, but also saw a point to social representations and then saw a point to social identity. And so what happened was a methodological pluralism took root in British social psychology predominantly. In other areas of the world you study social psychology and that means you're very well versed in quantitative techniques or qualitative techniques. But in Britain you get exposed to both, and you also get exposed to these three different traditions, and the reason why they kind of reconciled is because psychologists realized that they might be looking at individuals mostly and the brain and cognitive structures, but these also have something to do with communities and the socialization one gets by being born in a certain society, and then the cultural frameworks and discursive models that are historical in their origin that also influence the development, the ontological and ontogenetic development of the individual. So there was this kind of perhaps pragmatic reconciliation of three different traditions that allow psychologists to move from the micro to the macro and vice versa by taking different levels of analysis and relating findings that have been achieved using different methodological approaches altogether. But the findings can reconcile. Perhaps the methodology not so much, but the findings can reconcile. And the reason why this seemed to take root was because psychologists were then in a position to ward off the critiques that they had been facing for years. And there were predominantly two critiques. One was that the findings that are generated in a laboratory are not sensitive to context. See, if you take the real world and you put it in a laboratory, then you've got an artificial setting, and then you might find something that might be replicable in the laboratory, but the moment you take it out, there's other contextual features that are going to change that phenomenon completely. So that is one critique that was settled. The other critique was that, well, if you're doing research in the field and looking at discourses and then, media representations and so on and so forth, these findings are not sufficiently rigorous because they do not speak to the probability paradigm, and so they need to be taken, those findings need to be taken into the lab so that they can be scrutinized more rigorously, and then we can know something. Well, if one is sensitive to all of these, then one can play around with the applied context and the laboratory context and take findings from one area to the other to support, basically, what is being proposed as new knowledge. And so, to a certain extent, in British social psychology, these strides have been reconciled. And that also means that today there are not too many centers of excellence or centers of expertise. In most universities that you go to today, you're going to find a discursive psychologist, you're going to find a political psychologist, you're going to find an identity psychologist, you're going to find people who know qualitative and people who know quantitative. And so there's been this institutional weakening, not only for social representations theory, but also for social identity and also for discourse, because now you can do these kinds of things everywhere. But that is still distinguishable from other places around the world, like North America or Asia, Latin America, and Europe, that retain a bit of a different focus. And so the idea or the question that I want to pose here is, when we look at the social representations tradition of research, or perhaps the British social psychology program of research, do we see signs of a decaying program, or do we see signs of a growing program, a flourishing program of research? See, if we take the institution on its own and the extent to which a particular theoretical framework is represented within particular institutions, then one could argue that what we see is signs of decay, because the program has largely, well, dissipated everywhere, but it's not represented in any one institution. On the other hand, if we go to different and associated traditions, we can see a lot of cross-fertilization of ideas and a lot of integration of ideas. And so that would suggest that this is a growing research program, and that maybe that kind of specialization has run its course, and we're now moving on into a new era of what the research program is today and what it was meant to be, as it were. So it has changed over the years, but it remains alive and kicking in fertilizing other programs. And with that question, I hand over to Martin for part 3. But yeah, this is just to support it. You can
This is just some citation counts here to show that everything goes up here, but social representation falls somewhere in between prejudice research and minority research. And the black one is social representations. Seems to go up here, but this seems to indicate a little decline as well. Two phases of growth in the 80s and in the early 2000s. But anyway, not numbers is the point. So we talk about social representation, its institutional context, its history, coming out of overcoming the crisis of social psychology, the replication crisis of the 1970s, being part of that discussion and opening up the topics from ever shrinking to smaller experimental concerns of the lab to come back to the big issues. So let's talk about a little bit about what is this paradigm, or this what's the heuristic call. This goes back in principle to 4 studies. Psychoanalysis, its image and its public. Health and illness, mainly the comparison between understandings of health and illness in rural and urban France. Anne de Chateau, a study of madness in the psychiatric community, basically showing that people live with a modern idea of mental illness in the head and in conversation, but live with an old idea of contagion, separating themselves from the patients as if they would be contagious. So a difference between movement and mentality, and this is basically a sort of technique of analyzing the representational core in form of associations around the world, a kind of sociolinguistic analysis of meaning. But I think there are 4 elements which we think is the core of the research program. The first one has to do with communication. I think there are 2 ways of thinking about communication in a kind of a chain. Like Bartlett's serial reproduction, you can see there's a decay function. So here somebody finds a correlation. A and B are correlated, P56 under condition C, and then this moves through a communication chain All kinds of concerns are coming in, like press offices and television news and so on. And this gains meaning in that chain, to such an extent that in the end the grandmother thinks she needs to protect herself from something untoward. Okay? Now the question is whether such a chain is a decay function, or is kind of a meaning multiplication or meaning enrichment. And I think with social representation we are interested in how meaning is enriched here, how a correlation gains its causality along a cause like that. We know correlation is not causality, but the serial reproduction might just get it in. So why does it do that? This is a kind of interesting question. So communication, not a decay function, but an enrichment function. The second point is, and this goes back to la psychanalyse, psychoanalysis, whatever you believe about it, but it's a view of the human psyche, is represented among French Catholics, among French communists, and among an urban bourgeois elite in France in very different ways. And this can be compared, not whether they understand psychoanalysis correctly, but how do they differ among themselves. So that's representation as an intergroup context, where identity comes in, because these representations have to do with identity presentations, us and them. The third point is that representations are not just spots in time or photographs in time, but they might have a direction in time, what we call the project. It's not just a representation of a subject in relation to an object, but it has a project. It's in relation to some kind of intentionality into the future. That's what we call the Toblerone project. So any particular study is a principle of cut in the Toblerone. A subject talks to another subject onto an object, but we need to see this in context of a project for the future. The third element is, there are not just only one project about psychoanalysis or other things, but there is actually kind of a windrose or a water wheel model of competing, dancing around a boundary object. So we have overlapping triangles of subject talking to another subject about an object in relation to some kind of project for the future. These are the four basic ingredients I think makes the heuristic core of something we might call a research program of social representation. Now let me finish, and maybe open the conversation with, as well, with two examples. There are lots of challenges at the moment where we think social representation makes a big difference. It's an older challenge to describe the social reality in taxonomic versus natural groups. Whoever works in marketing peddles every day with taxonomic groups, statistical definitions of clusters of who thinks what. They have nothing to do with how people understand themselves. They're just taxonomic impositions, observer categories. And that's different from natural groups, social milieux, which I think we would have to consider. Popular science is an interesting topic, continues to be very fertile territory for social representation study. And the fundamental axiom, I would think, is representation have to see following function, identity presentation, and so on. A number of challenges we might be able to talk about. Let me just take two. This is an opportunity. It's as if computer technology suddenly lives up to the claims of social representation. That you have a social structure, and the social structure produces a certain structure of mentality. This I've seen a lot. These are so-called echo chambers in the network structures. But we can also do network structures on words, on concepts that are flourishing, that you could scrape out from the network. So you could, in principle, imagine that a structure that is hierarchically organized creates a mentality that dreams of anarchy. Or a structure that is anarchically organized, no hierarchy, horizontally, dreams of order and hierarchy. This is a kind of a Durkheimian vision of reversing the social structure and the mentality. We could, in principle, test something like that. So the methodology is increasingly available for doing this dual two-level analysis of mentality and social structure at the same time. Now, let me give you another example where I think social representation can make a real difference in our understanding. In my world, popular science, social representations of science, in the 1970s, many countries started to worry about anti-science. The population getting lost in relation to scientific institutions, no longer supporting science, so a lot of research came on board. But it came on board under the so-called Miller-Ellman model, which basically assumed science is like foreign policy. It's not a partisan issue. The Republicans or the Democrats, they have no particular views on science. They all share the idea it's good. We need to fund it, maybe more or less. It's a kind of hierarchical model of an elite, worry about maybe an attentive public, and there's a lot of non-attentive public. It doesn't matter so much. More worrying about here. We clearly have moved away from that, and this creates a lot of polemic, to a bifurcation, a bipolarity of representations. Except nobody talks about representation. People invent new words now for the fact that if you are a Democrat, I think blue is Democrat. No, blue is. I always use that word. Yeah, blue is Democrat, and red is Republican. They have different views on science. A lot of Democrats try to think blue is anti-science, but I think that's mistaken. What you basically get is a different portfolio of interests in science. If you are a Republican, you are for coal mining independent of how much you know about it. And if you are a Democrat, the more you know about coal mining, the more you are against. So there is this kind of CO2 concern. If you consider nuclear power, if you are a Republican, the more you know about it, the more you go for it. If you are a Democrat, you're just against nuclear power in majority. And clearly, the climate change story you probably know, it is not an issue of variance for Republicans. It is a clear issue for variance. More knowledge makes you a climate protector in the Democratic area. So what you get here is a kind of a portfolio of different concerns about science in the different communities. And this, I think, is a natural cause for social representations. I think that's more or less it. Let's summarize this a bit. In summary, social representation approach, if we focus on persons, the authors, the leaders, you see they will probably decline. Most of them have died. Institutional death we have, for many reasons, REF and others, undercut, take the carpet away from these activities. But if you focus on ideas, you might see progress. This is Robert Musil, the man without politics. So social representation reminds us, you look for social cultural segmentations. We have it everywhere. Everybody is worried about echo chambers. Comparing episteme with lay personality, the old problem of science, popular science. Popular science is a decay function of science. Let's work on this. Episteme is the frame of reference. What about comparing different doxas? Comparing red with green? Comparing red with blue? Comparing different echo chambers and understand the functionality of their portfolio of science. This is different doxas on a boundary logic. Communication flows, no decay function, but symbolic coping. Take the virus. I think the virus is a classic example of social representation. You have this virus going global, but the response is not unique in every country. It's unique in every country. It's not unified. So one needs to understand how people understand the virus and even how policy engages the virus, under what model. Clearly a problem of social representation. Consider these discourses that emerge as a degree of resistance or a degree of sophistication. That's fine, one can do this, but it has to do with anxiety management, with coping, with uncertainty, identity presentation in all this, in this relation. They're not focused on truth. They have other functions. What else can we say? Authority of science is not challenged totally, but punctual, depending on which issue. The bungee jump model of scientific authority, as I call it, not as authority is going down the drain of science, but punctual, depending on the scandal that is happening. Methods, dual level dynamic networks. This one we leave, will take a longer time here. But the crucial thing, I think, is to compare doxas, to compare common sense. We are invited to do with social organization, not to compare an authority versus the hoi polloi, having somehow deviant notions that we need to clarify, that we need to compare. Okay, I think that's all I want to say. Colleagues, you want to add?
No, thank you very much.